This is Jung's philosophical analysis of the concept of responsibility as having both an individual and social political sense. A quick note on her conceptual analysis. Making distinctions to get clear on logical puzzles embedded in our moral conversations is a standard philosophical move. So in philosophy, we often see thinkers attempt to solve or resolve a problem by drawing a significant distinction within a concept to reveal the more granular or specific concepts therein, like identifying species within a genus. So responsibility is a genus, and Jung is saying there are species of responsibility, each with a different domain of applicability. The liability model applies to interpersonal contexts involving a bad actor of sorts, someone whose decisions are directly responsible for the outcomes. Political responsibility applies to those domains where there is no one actor or action that can be called responsible, but different aspects of our social existence interact in such a way as to create obstacles for folks in their efforts to live well. We are politically responsible for these aspects of our social structure that can interact in such a way as to create these kinds of obstacles for folks, but none of us are to blame. Without highlighting these different species of responsibility, we are unequipped conceptually to deal with the necessary changes in our social structure. So now let's look at the 5 features of political responsibility that Jung discusses, and notice that she frames these 5 features in comparison to the liability model, or to the notion of blame. The 5 features of political responsibility that Jung names are as follows. 1. Political responsibility does not isolate some responsible parties in order to absolve others. 2. Blame seeks remedy for deviation from an acceptable norm, but political responsibility concerns structural causes that are normal and ongoing. 3. Political responsibility is more forward-looking than backward-looking. 4. What it means to assign political responsibility is more open and discretionary than what it means to judge an agent blameworthy. 5. An agent shares political responsibility with others whose actions contribute to the structural processes that produce injustice. So now let's take a look at each feature one at a time. Political responsibility does not isolate some responsible parties in order to absolve others. This is feature 1. Jung explains this feature by saying, quote, where there are structural injustices, finding that some people are guilty of perpetuating specific wrongful actions does not absolve others whose actions contribute to the outcomes from bearing responsibility. She says that on page 12. The point is not to the point of political responsibility is not to identify individuals to blame and clear other individuals of blame. For example, the saying, not my monkeys, not my circus, evokes this kind of idea, this idea captured by the liability model, or closer to it anyway. When seeing that some element of our social structure is going wrong, we might be inclined to think, I didn't cause the problem, so it's not my problem to fix it. Now, we can, of course, think of situations where this is a fine attitude to have, that a problem you did not cause is not your problem to fix. But, Jung argues, in the case of making changes to the ways that governmental departments, different industries, or sectors of the economy, etc., interact, we are all actually responsible for making efforts to change those ways they interact via voting, canvassing, and other political engagement or social literacy. So the point is of political responsibility, just because they may not be your monkeys, it is your circus because it is all of our circus. Feature 2, according to Jung, is that political responsibility concerns structural causes that are normal and ongoing. This feature calls into question the very background norms, which the liability model of responsibility uses to evaluate wrongdoing. Political responsibility, quote, evaluates not a harm that deviates from the normal and accepted, but rather often brings into question precisely the background conditions that ascriptions of blame or fault assume as normal. When we judge the structural injustice, that structural injustice exists, we are saying precisely that at least some of the normal and accepted background conditions of action are not morally acceptable, end quote. She says that on page 12. Feature 3 is that political responsibility is forward-looking. There are two aspects to this feature. One, we cannot isolate those responsible for structural problems. Because we're all responsible, the point cannot be to do so, right? That's the idea here. We are all responsible, and so the point of political responsibility cannot be simply to isolate any individual responsible for structural problems. And two, blame and praise are primarily backward-looking. We assign them in order to right some wrong that has already happened. But structural injustices are ongoing, and thus the point is, quote, to look forward to an intervention in the process that will change it, i.e., the structure that is causing harm, end quote. She says that on page 13. Feature 4 is that taking up political responsibility is more open and discretionary. Here, we see a distinction between duty and responsibility. Duty understood as a moral law or a moral obligation naming a specific action or action type that must be observed in all cases. We must carry out our responsibilities, but how we do so is adaptable. We need to factor in what the responsibilities are for and what the capabilities of agents are, and the content of the action. Context of the action. As Young states, quote, the future is unpredictable enough that one must be prepared to change a course of action because of unanticipated consequences, end quote. She says that on page 14. So because it is forward-looking and aimed at correcting an ongoing harm, it needs to be adaptable. Political responsibility. Our responsibilities need to be adaptable. And Young goes on to say, quote, a duty specifies a rule that an agent should follow. One has fulfilled the duty if one has performed the required actions. Carrying out a responsibility, on the other hand, consists in seeking to bring about a specified outcome. It is possible to act in accord with rules of morality and yet not have discharged one's responsibilities because one has not achieved the required outcome, end quote. She says that on page 14. And the fifth feature is that an agent shares political responsibility with others whose actions contribute to the structural processes that produce injustice. According to Young, quote, taking political responsibility means acknowledging that one participates in social processes that have some unjust outcomes, and one participates with many others, end quote. She says that on page 15. Taking political responsibility means, instead of making amends for what one has done, one acts so as to prevent the event from happening again. And to do this, we must work from our own social position and work with others from varying social positions. So taking political responsibility can look like participating in public discourse and collective action. For example, talking to each other or calling and emailing our representatives, attending town halls, participating in rallies and protests when applicable. Can look like organizing media or political campaigns to bring light and attention to an issue of structural injustice. Can look like backing elected officials and candidates that can change how processes work so they are less unjust. And importantly, even those harmed by a structural injustice can share political responsibility. To this last point, Young argues that political responsibility applies to, quote, even those who can properly be argued to be victims of structural injustice can be called to a responsibility that they share with others in the structures excuse me, can be called to a responsibility that they share with others in the structures to engage in actions directed at transforming the structures. Indeed, on many issues, those who might be argued to be in less advantaged positions in the structures ought to take the lead in organizing and proposing remedies for injustice, because their interests might be argued as the most acutely at stake, and their social position offers them a unique understanding of the likely effects of policies and actions proposed by others situated in more powerful or privileged positions, end quote. Young says all of that on page 15. Her point being, then, folks who are harmed by a structural injustice can nonetheless share political responsibility for changing the processes responsible for that injustice. And it will often be the case that folks who are in fact the victims of a structural injustice are going to be in an epistemic position, meaning they are going to know more or know better, or more likely know more or know better, how particular policies or law changes or other structural changes will affect the actual outcomes, right? Whether or not they have a likelihood of being successful. So, and this explanation from Young is an ontological and epistemological point about why those who are negatively affected share in the responsibility to correct the structures responsible for those effects.